Now we're going to be getting into the various movements of this period, the first of which is Bauhaus, which is going to be incredibly influential as we move forward. It's going to come out of the Weimar Republic in Germany. And what's happening at the time is, of course, the German economy had completely collapsed following World War I, in part because of the war effort and in part because of reparations. The landscape is in ruins, not because of war as such, but because of the poverty and difficulties of World War I. They go through hyperinflation and everything else, and they're trying to focus on this idea of focusing on the worker, on the artisan, on housing. And of course, Bauhaus is going to speak to all of that. Now, Bauhaus's aim was to bring people working in architecture, modern technology, and decorative arts together to learn from one another. This is going to be very different from what we've seen in the past. We don't see the separation between crafts and arts. They're going to try and bring them together, at least initially, up until around 1925, when things change a little bit. But Bauhaus is going to give us much of what will be known as the international style later on. Now, what they're doing is they're tying ideas together. So early on, they're going to have these preliminary courses where they're focusing on materials more than anything else. How do these materials function? What's their best use, etc. And then they start to move into the study of nature, fabrics, etc. And then they get into more specific materials. But the idea is that they can work in multiple areas at any given time. So one student could work in metals and wood at the same time. And we'll see that in the furniture and the architecture. The one thing they don't do is they don't teach art history. The reason is that they don't want people being or focusing on what has come in the past. Instead, they want them to have a clean slate to work forward in the future. This is very opposite to pretty much every other trend that we see, where people look back in order to create something new, as we've seen with all of the revivals, for example. Now, don't get too excited about this, because of course, when we get into interior design and the development of interior designers, they will be the ones who need to know what has come in the past in interior design, hence classes like this one, History of Interior Design. Now, what you're going to see coming out of Bauhaus is going to be pieces that are frequently mixed media. They're going to be very practical. The idea is very much arts and crafts. In fact, they're trying to combine mass manufacturing ideas and populist ideas with the arts and crafts movement. So we get chairs like this, where it looks very, very complicated, and you can imagine the skill that went into it. But yet you can also see the practical use of it. You could comfortably sit in that chair and probably really enjoy it just looking at this back. You've got the two supports. They're not hard wood, they're slings, so it's going to be softer and more supportive than what you would be used to. Same thing with the seat coming up. As long as you're tall enough to sit in it, this is going to be very, very comfortable. Now, in terms of architecture, they're going to do something a little different. Building plans tend to be open and geometric. Structural forms were adapted to the materials used. They included flat roofs, steel frameworks, and glass curtain walls, all things that we saw in skyscrapers. We're going to get into that more a little bit later on. We see a lot of linear forms, including bands of windows and completely functional designs, which will characterize their buildings. There's nothing here that is there purely for aesthetic purposes. It all has a functional, pragmatic purpose behind it. And one of the most famous structures that they will build is going to be the Fagus factory. And what you see here is, again, this massive wall of glass. And they can do this because of the new materials that they have, the use of steel, the use of things like lightweight concrete. And this allows that sort of arts and crafts idea of combining the indoors and the outdoors by creating windows and letting in that natural light. It is seen as healthy and good at the time to do that, just to help the morale of the workers, help the physical health of the workers in so many ways. So it's going to be seen as a particularly innovative structure. And we see that the Bauhaus building really mimics a lot of those ideas. Again, that giant glass curtain wall. Why have a wall there when all this is hallway? Let that light into the rooms, let that light into the space. When you need to have a wall, make sure it's in a place that, well, you don't have another choice. For example, a stairwell. They use a lot of that linearity that we saw from arts and crafts. So a lot of horizontals and verticals. You could imagine Frank Lloyd Wright creating something very, very similar to this. In terms of furniture, a lot of what they're going to do is going to be later known as international style, and I'll dig into it a little bit more later. But what we tend to see is a lot of mixed media and mixing ideas that we haven't seen in the past. For example, painted materials on natural wood furniture, such as these nesting tables, or a mix of steel, in this case chromed steel, and cushions. Which we see in this sort of mid-century international style couch, or again in the Wasili chair, which we'll get into more in the future. Now, unfortunately, the entire Bauhaus movement falls apart in about 1933 because the Nazis don't agree with their ideas. So many of the leaders, including Walter Gropius, and others, will immigrate to the United States, bringing their style and ideas with them, and that is how we make that transition into the so-called international style. Now, the history of Bauhaus is an interesting one. I just want to hit this real quick. We see it starting in 1919. Again, that reaction against the war and the need to rebuild. We'll see the move due to political pressure. There's always political pressure on the Bauhaus. Of course, the arts are the sort of place that get a lot of pressure in those environments. We will see other design schools come out of this, such as Cranbrook. Eventually, we'll see Bauhaus closing in 1933. One of their key instructors, Hans Knoll, will go ahead and found Knoll Furniture. In 1938, we'll see Ron Welch turning up at Knoll in 1979. And then we will see a resurgence of Bauhaus in 1994 after the fall of the Iron Curtain.